Once upon a time, there was a young girl from Greece with beautiful long blonde hair and brilliant blue eyes. She was sent to Egypt to be a servant girl and live with a kind old man and his 3 daughters, who all had long black hair and green eyes. They would tease the servant girl for looking different and treated her terribly. The Greek girl was made to do all the chores around the house, while her 3 stepsisters went out and had fun. Yet one day, the king of Egypt announced that he was to throw a grand celebration in honor of his coronation, and that all in the land were invited. The old man gifted the servant girl with a pair of red and gold sandals for her to wear to the coronation. But when the 3 stepsisters found out, they became so jealous that the servant girl may distract from them in the presence of the soon-to-be pharaoh, came up with a devious plan to keep the servant girl away. They told her to go to the river and wash all of the laundry, and that she may only come when she is done. Saddened by this, she took the basket of laundry to the river, took off her red and gold sandals, leaving them on the riverbank, and got into the water to wash the linen. She began to cry, and so animals nearby came to comfort her: the hippopotamus, the crocodile, deer, and monkeys. Then a large eagle swept down from the heavens and picked up one of her sandals and flew away with it. Now she would surely never make it to the pharaoh's coronation. The eagle flew over the jubilant crowds celebrating the new king of Egypt and dropped the red and gold sandal right onto the lap of the king. Bewitched by the beauty of the sandal, he sent his men out into the land to find the woman to whom the sandal belonged. Days later, the pharaoh and his men happened upon the house of the old man. There he was greeted by the servant girl. He saw that she was walking with only one sandal of the same red and gold color. He made her try on the one that fell into his lap. A perfect fit. And so the servant girl and the pharaoh were married, thus making her the new queen of Egypt. If this story sounds familiar to you, that's because it is the oldest version of the Cinderella fable that has ever been told. The servant girl was a Greek woman known as Rhodopis, Rhodopis, or Dorica. How much of this story is myth, and how much is based on actual history? How much of this fantastical tale should we believe?
A Greek woman brought to ancient Egypt to become a servant girl for an old man. Yet she was able to become a princess, marry a pharaoh, and become the queen of Egypt. But who is this mysterious Cinderella of ancient Egypt? Who is Rhodopis?
The true parts of the Egyptian Cinderella story first appear in writings around 455 BC by the Greek writer Herodotus. That's over 123 years before Alexander the Great became pharaoh. Herodotus had traveled extensively in Egypt, writing down a version of the civilization's history, learned from stories from locals and of what he could badly decipher. The majority of Herodotus's writings can be dismissed as fiction, since in recent years, many of the things that he had written about have been proved otherwise, especially when he was writing about things that happened already 2,000 years before his arrival in Egypt. This could all be down to misinterpreting a language that was not his first.
This story of an ancient Egyptian Cinderella seems to be complete fabrication, yet there are some ancient Greek texts that explain a story pretty similar. However, how did we end up with this idea that we have the Cinderella story in ancient Egypt? There is a story from a Greek writer, Herodotus, about a woman who was sent here, but she was no servant girl. She had more darker and more mysterious ways.
Herodotus writes about Rhodopis being a hetera, which back in the day meant someone who accompanied you, providing conversation and entertainment. However, the term hetera also means prostitute. She served as a slave with the Greek fable writer Aesop. This could provide the link to the myths of Rhodopis communing with animals. Rhodopis was owned by Iadmon, who then sold her to a new owner named Xanthus. He would then take Rhodopis to a new exotic location, a place that shared great ties with the kingdoms of Greece, Egypt. They moved to the city of Naucratis in the Nile Delta, or as the ancient Egyptians called it, Per Merit, place of happiness. The city of Naucratis was the first permanent Greek settlement in Egypt. In 610 BC, Egypt's 26th dynasty was ruled by a pharaoh named Psamtik I in the Nile Delta. Fleeing political unrest in Mycenaean Greece, a fleet of ships arrived in Egypt. Already having good ties with Egypt, these Greeks sought refuge in Egypt. Pharaoh Psamtik consulted with the oracle at Buto, who told him to allow the bronze men of Greece, whom came from the sea, to reside in Naucratis. For this, these Greeks would also become part of the pharaoh's army. This Greek and Egyptian army, under the succeeding Pharaoh Aparis, or Wahibra, fought against an Egyptian army general. They were defeated and a new pharaoh was crowned, named AHMOSE II, or Amasis, as the Hellenic Greeks called him. It was during the reign of Pharaoh Amasis that Rhodopis was taken to Egypt by her owner. Rhodopis would have experienced an idyllic setting in the lush green of the Nile Delta, surrounded not only by Egyptians, but by Greeks as well. With a constant trade of foreigners coming in and out of the city with their trade, coming to the pharaoh's residence in the city of Sais nearby. Egypt sent out linen, perfume, and papyrus to Greece. In return, they received much silver and olive oils. Even though Rhodopis was in all respective terms a slave or a glorified prostitute, she did enjoy quite some comforts. It was here in Naucratis that Rhodopis's life would change. She was to meet the brother of one of ancient Greece's most famous female writers, Sappho. His name was Charaxus. Herodotus tells us that Charaxus and Rhodopis fell in love, but what could he do? Rhodopis was owned by another man. He paid off Xanthus, and from that moment on, Rhodopis was a free woman, and able to live with Charaxus. It is hinted at, however, that she continued to earn a living from being paid for sexual favors by other men, becoming a rich woman in Naucratis. But greed would soon consume Rhodopis. She turned on the man that freed her. She stole much of his property, and making him flee Egypt in shame, Sappho, who is famous for her writings about feminine love, didn't seem to have much affection for Rhodopis. It is from Sappho's writings that we know that Rhodopis stole from Charaxus, and she even goes on to condemn her brother for becoming involved with Rhodopis, going as far as stating that her name itself, Rhodopis, is nothing more than a mere pseudonym, as it meant rosy cheeks, which could link her to her profession. Sappho gives us Rhodopis' real name, Dorica. Rhodopis, now an independent woman, lives a lavish lifestyle. Yet, there must have been some sort of guilt for her actions. She then would make a substantial offering to a temple in Greece. High up in the mountains on the Greek mainland was a sacred site. A site that almost everyone from the ancient world wanted to visit for one specific reason: to consult with one of the most renowned oracles. Welcome to Delphi. For centuries, both Greeks and foreigners, royal and common, would come to leave offerings here and seek the advice of the oracle. This even included some Egyptians, as many Egyptian objects were found here. Rhodopis was no exception to this. Being a Greek woman living in Egypt, a pilgrimage to Delphi would not be unusual. Rhodopis, now a rich woman, offered 10 iron oxen cooking rotisseries. Herodotus even states that he had seen these himself in the treasury building of the people from Chios. He suggests that the offering to Apollo was a way to entice even more men into the grasps of Rhodopis. This is the Temple of Apollo here at Delphi. It was once a huge temple that received so many visitors and so many gifts from all around the world. And further behind the temple is where the famed Oracle of Delphi lived. Now, this is where the phrase, "know thyself," comes from. Above the temple, here, would have been the text, "know thyself," which means to know the answers to these questions within yourself. In the year 548 BC, a great fire broke out at Delphi. The majority of the temple was destroyed. Pharaoh Amasis paid for the reconstruction of the temple with 1,000 talents of gold, thus further closening the ties between Egypt and their allies in Greece. It is probably around this time that Rhodopis also gave her offering at Delphi. This is where Pharaoh Amasis and his wife, who was apparently a Greek princess, sent money to rebuild this temple when it burnt down. So this is again showing the connection of the Greeks and the Egyptians, the camaraderie from an Egyptian pharaoh to rebuild a Greek temple. This must have been so important in the ancient world. But also, could this explain the connection between Rhodopis and Pharaoh Amasis? This could be the deciding factor on whether she was real or not.
Who really was the pharaoh that Rhodopis married? According to many, it was Pharaoh AHMOSE II, or as the Greeks call him, Amasis. This is a beautiful green stone head of Pharaoh Amasis II, because he was named Amasis probably about 1,000 years after the first Pharaoh Amasis. And here he is. This is the mythical pharaoh that possibly married the Greek slave girl Rhodopis. This could be him. We're not sure, but isn't he just magnificent to behold?
Pharaoh Amasis went on to have repelled the forces of Persia invading with the help of the Greeks. However, after his death, the next pharaoh, Psamtik III, would fail. The Persians would invade Egypt. This would all link up to Alexander the Great expelling the Persians from Egypt, and thus showing the continued support of Egypt from the Hellenic Greek kingdoms.
This story of an Egyptian Cinderella seems to be complete fabrication. Yet we have some evidence from ancient Greek writers about a woman that was sent to Egypt and became a queen. But which should we believe? Well, let's investigate the differences between the texts.
Herodotus did live 100 years after the life of Rhodopis and Pharaoh Amasis, so he did manage to get some of his story completely wrong, even admitting it himself. A local folk legend was prominent at the time of Herodotus, saying that the lover of Rhodopis had built her a pyramid for her tomb. The legend says that this pyramid was the third largest of the pyramids at Giza. However, Herodotus went to great lengths to prove in his writings that this was a mere myth, and that the pyramid in question was built for Pharaoh Menkaure over 2,000 years before. For centuries, it appears that this myth of Rhodopis having a pyramid continued. Ancient writers like Pliny the Elder, Strabo, and Diodorus persisted that this story was true, despite archaeological evidence. However, the confusion could be explained. If Rhodopis was indeed influential in Pharaoh Amasis's reign, because of her profession, she could easily be misconstrued in being in the pharaoh's harem of women. These were often made up of influential women from all around the ancient world. It is known that pharaohs built their queens' tombs, especially in the Old Kingdom. These pharaohs built smaller pyramids next to their own for their queens to be buried in, such as Menkaure with his pyramid and the three queens' pyramids alongside. Yet Rhodopis was not a queen. A mythical Egyptian pharaoh queen from the 6th dynasty in 2181 BC named Nitocris accounts for this confusion. Pharaoh Nitocris is said by both Julius Africanus and Eusebius to have constructed herself a burial pyramid. These writers lived around 30 AD, 2,500 years after Pharaoh Nitocris was said to have taken the throne by force. And there is almost no evidence to say that the Old Kingdom female pharaoh that the Greeks shrouded in myth even ruled Egypt. It is feasible, however, that these writers confused the oral histories yet again with another woman named Nitocris from a much more recent date. In 656 BC, Pharaoh Psamtik I sent his daughter to Waset, or Luxor today, where she was to be adopted by a Nubian woman who was ruling in Luxor as the High Priestess, or also known as the God's Wife, Amuniadris II. Egypt at the time was slowly claiming back its rule after near 100 years under the Nubians. Nitocris was the daughter of a native Egyptian pharaoh, and with her finally becoming the god's wife in Luxor, Egypt was now fully under Egyptian rule yet again. The story of the Nitocris who supposedly built a pyramid and the Nitocris who restored full Egyptian power could easily have been confused by Greek writers who came hundreds of years later. and the daughter of Pharaoh Amasis from the time of Rhodopis was also named Nitocris II, who served as the penultimate god's wife, as well as the final female high priest of Amun in Luxor. All of these tales of Nitocris could have culminated in one fantastic tale retold by the Greeks. But all of these tales would then imply that Rhodopis was related to the Egyptian royalty somehow, and certainly not of the harem, but a queen. Where does this come from? We see here in this early Greek period tomb, this woman with this beautiful linen dress. You can see the skin color and the beautiful patterns still on her dress. But what's most interesting, she's wearing a cobra on her forehead. This is a royal woman.
Now, we don't know if Rhodopis was a real person or if she was mythological in the Greek sense, but we do know that she was a blonde woman. So when we look at a statue made out of ivory, such as this, we get a sort of idea of Rhodopis.
Around 30 BC, just before the death of Cleopatra and during the Roman occupation of Egypt, a Greek geographer named Strabo traveled through the country and recounted many tales. It is Strabo who first creates the fable of Rhodopis being brought to Egypt as a servant girl, and it is from Strabo that the story of the eagle coming down and picking up the red and gold sandal while Rhodopis was in the river at Naucratis, carrying it to Pharaoh, and ultimately the Pharaoh finding the owner of the sandal, marrying her and making her queen of Egypt. Strabo clearly names both Rhodopis and Pharaoh Amasis in this story, and almost 200 years later, the Roman writer Aelian repeated the story of Rhodopis marrying a pharaoh and becoming queen of Egypt. However, he changes the name of the pharaoh from Amasis II to Psamtik III, the son of Amasis.
Like I said, we don't know if Rhodopis was a real person or not, but what we do know from the story is that the old man that had adopted her to become a slave girl, a servant girl, gave her red slippers. And as the story goes, as she was washing the linen, as we see here, the linen, as she was washing it in the river, a falcon came down and picked up one of her shoes and dropped it on the Pharaoh's lap. And he set out to find Rhodopis based on these tiny little red sandals. Now, we don't know whose sandals these are, but wouldn't it be amazing to think the story of Rhodopis would have been about a pair of shoes, pretty much like those.
Clearly, this fairy tale of a Greek servant woman marrying a pharaoh and becoming queen had strong roots in the ancient world, as it continued being retold for hundreds of years. In my opinion, the queen part of Rhodopis is probably being confused with Nitocris in all her various iterations, as the final Nitocris is in fact the daughter of Pharaoh Amasis and the sister of Pharaoh Psamtik III. Though this still leaves the question, where does the tale of the Greek woman marrying a pharaoh come from? Nitocris was not a Greek, she was an Egyptian. While all of this was happening around the reign of Amasis, Amasis did indeed marry a Greek woman, but we know her name was not Rhodopis. Herodotus goes on to write that the Greek king of Cyrene, who was an ally of Egypt, allowed Pharaoh Amasis to marry his daughter, Princess Ladike. Ladike lived in the Egyptian delta at Sais with Amasis. He writes that they did not consummate their marriage, and this would explain why Amasis had no stela or statues made of the Greek princess, now Egyptian queen, Ladike, with only the Greek record of this Greek queen of Egypt remaining. It is this era that causes many Greek writers to simply pick up the name of the infamous Greek woman living in Egypt, Rhodopis, and she would replace Ladike in the story. So this answers many of the questions, although there is still the fairy tale aspect. The eagle picking up the sandal. It seems Strabo had a large imagination indeed, but there is a rather symbolic statement happening here. Strabo not knowing how to explain the details of how a Greek woman became an Egyptian queen, and not knowing all the facts, creates this fable. First off, it would have been a falcon picking up the sandal, but to link this to some divine Greek myth, Strabo substitutes the falcon for an eagle. The eagle was, after all, a symbol of Greek royalty as well as linked to the Greek god Zeus, thus showing that the eagle selected this Greek woman and creating a more symbolic cause for this woman becoming a queen of Egypt. A source of Strabo's airborne myth could come from many of the Greek artifacts that have been found in Naucratis in Egypt. A popular motif from pottery in the Greco-Egyptian city was that of a seated man with a large eagle seemingly placing something on his lap. Historians are divided whether this is Zeus or Prometheus, but that is beside the point. What we see here is what could have inspired the story of the eagle placing the sandal on the lap of the pharaoh. After all, the man is seated on a throne, and some could say that the beard looks very much like that of a pharaoh. And the biggest clue is that plates like this come right from the middle of Pharaoh Amasis' reign in Naucratis. Whether this story is fictional, it can all be linked back to certain events that took place. It may not all be from the same person, but it does make one good story. And it created a story that continued for thousands of years and adapted its way into becoming Cinderella.
Herodotus had this idea about this woman brought to Egypt from Greece. Yet, how do we end up with the current version of the story of Rhodopis?
The Cinderella-type story reappears in China around 600 AD. In the 12th century, a French poet writes a story called The Ash Tree Girl, where the fable of Cinderella takes more form, as well as the starting of the girl's name being linked to cinders from a fire. Then, in 1634, the Italian writer Giambattista Basile included a story called La Gatta Cenerentola, or in English, The Cat Cinderella. Clearly they had read the story from Strabo or Aeneid, as Roman and Greek histories were studied in most of the fairly modern world. Then Charles Perrault, in 1697 AD, writes a similar story with the lead character being called Cinderella. Centuries later, in 1812, the Grimm brothers published their story of Cinderella. The Cinderella-type story was told around the world in many manifestations, though of course now the most famous is the retelling by Disney in 1950. Though much of the intrigue around the story of Rhodopis comes from the author Olive Beaupre Miller in the late 1800s, who found the Grimm's version of Cinderella to be too dark for her daughter. She had read about Rhodopis in Strabo's works, and thus made an amalgam of both, creating the version today. Yet whether based in fact or complete fiction, it is clear that the essence of Cinderella's story originated in Egypt, all because of a Greek woman called Rhodopis.
Rhodopis appears to be a modern fairy tale created in the 20th century. This idea of an ancient Egyptian Cinderella never actually happened. It was based loosely on ancient accounts. So therefore, we can really say that there was no Cinderella in ancient Egypt. The story never happened after all.